Hi everyone, and welcome to the July edition of CyberSciBar. For all of you that are watching in the UK, I hope you're enjoying the wonderful weather that we're having at the moment. And if you were forced to go into work today, like I was, I hope at least the building you were in had some form of air conditioning, which my building did not. Particularly in weather like this, I'd like to thank everyone tuning in tonight. I know it's particularly difficult now everything's opening back up to drag yourself back indoors to another online event, so we really appreciate it. For those of you that haven't joined CyberSciBar before, welcome, thanks for joining. The event tonight is hosted by Palace of Science, and we are a not-for-profit organisation based in the northeast of England, and we run a series of events throughout the year to showcase all the fantastic science and research happening in the northeast. And really importantly, we do that in a way that brings it makes it accessible to the public. So we're really keen on letting the public know about all the great science and research happening in the northeast, and in a way that they can understand. So tonight's event, CyberSciBar, it's a very informal talk from generally an academic or researcher from the northeast that discusses the work they do in their field. In the before times, before the pandemic, we used to host this event in person, usually in a bar or a pub, and it had a really great sort of social aspect to it, which obviously online is a little more difficult to recreate, but it's not impossible. Here on Twitch, you will see on the right-hand side that there is a chat box. You'll see occasionally some messages from our moderator, Callum, this evening. Please do feel free to put some messages in there, say hi, tell us where you're watching from. And of course, you can use that chat box if you have any questions about tonight's event or the topic, then please do put them in there. So the talk tonight will last about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will take a 5-minute break in which you will be treated to a lovely AI-themed quiz put together by one of our volunteers, Anna, and then we'll come back for a question and answer session. So tonight's speaker is very keen to answer any questions you might have about the talk tonight, so don't be shy, please stick them in the chat box and we'll come back during the question and answer session and we'll get to those. So that's how tonight's going to work. That's pretty much everything from me, which leads me to introduce tonight's speaker. So the topic tonight actually was a request from one of our fantastic audience members. They contacted us through social media to ask if we knew anyone that was doing work on AI, and in particular the consequences of AI in society, particularly the ethical considerations. Now, this certainly isn't my area of expertise, but I am, in my day job, I'm a researcher by training, and so I used all of them years of researcher training, and I Googled it. And the first thing to pop up was a new journal, an academic journal that was established last year titled AI and Ethics. And it just so happened that the co-editor-in-chief of that journal just happened to be the Pro Vice Chancellor of one of the incredible universities here in the northeast, the University of Sunderland. So I really got lucky with that. So if you will please join me to give a warm virtual welcome to our speaker tonight, Professor John MacIntyre.
Thanks very much, Nicola, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. So, as Nicola said, the kind of task was to talk about where we are with AI, where AI is going, and some of the issues which are emerging around AI. And you can see that here I've kind of posed semi-rhetorical question, taking the tobacco wave of AI to a little bit leading, and certainly the statement why I believe the future of AI must be based on ethical AI. I'm going to talk about what those things mean. So. For those that may be some real AI pros in the audience, but some maybe not so much. One of the questions I've been asking is what is AI? And this is an interesting definition. I've picked out a couple of things in bold here for you to look at, because this definition is quite simplistic actually, because not least it talks about the simulation of human intelligence. Actually, quite a lot of AI mimics natural but not necessarily human intelligence. And again, I could go into that later. But certainly the idea of adaptive systems which are tasked with some kind of problem solving and are based around some kind of natural model. So there's an awful lot to that, and I'll explore that more. And you'll hear terms like machine learning, deep learning, AI. And there's a very simple graphic, which if you think of Russian dolls, machine learning is a subset of artificial intelligence, and deep learning has become a subset of that, which is particularly to do with AI systems which train themselves, and particularly around things like speech and image recognition, with huge volumes of data, far, far greater than the kind of data that was available to me when I started my career in applied AI 30 years ago. And I just thought I'd pick out that we're all living through the pandemic, and it's been a very challenging period. And the pandemic actually has highlighted some of the issues around AI, both the benefits of AI and some of the risks. There are real concerns, questions about trust, questions about the ethics of the way AI has been used, developing AI in COVID. It's obvious, isn't it, that through this pandemic, we're going to try and use every tool that we can to get us all through. AI can and has been used very effectively in some cases, but it's also true that some of the applications developed for COVID have been rushed through without the kind of rigor in either design or testing that would normally be the case. And it has already become clear that there are consequences to that. And things around, for example, privacy issues around track and trace. There's been quite a significant set of concerns around those. Concerns around the AI embedded on your phone from these applications, and whether or not that will stay in place even when you think the app is no longer there. Jason Borenstein is actually a member of the editorial board of our new journal, and he talks in this piece here about whether or not the risks outweigh the rewards. And I think when you get headlines like this, is AI a hammer in search of a nail? Can you trust AI? Can you have empathy? Can AI have empathy? And when you get a publication like The Lancet talking about whether or not AI is actually a savior or a saboteur in COVID, then you know that you've got a real issue at hand. Now, it is absolutely clear that AI is booming, and it's booming from an R&D, from a research point of view, from a development point of view, from a commercialization point of view. When you look at the global growth of AI, look at these numbers. I can remember when the potential commercial revenue of AI was talked about in the millions and then tens of millions, and now it's in several billions. But I thought this was interesting because you look at just in December of 2019, that headline talks about AI revenues of 100 billion by 2025. And now, this is only in February of this year, that number has already gone to 500 billion. So we're talking about an exponential growth in the expectation of commercial return out of AI. And I'm also the editor-in-chief of this journal. I've been the editor-in-chief of this journal now since 1996. Started off as a very parochial UK-based thing. Really came out of an applications forum I set up back in the 1990s, which I was involved in, to try and show people that AI, particularly neural networks, should be used to solve real problems and do useful things. And that growth, of course, I'd love to tell you that the reason that you see that graph is because I'm a fantastic editor. But I think actually the reality is this journal was before its time in the early 1990s, and it's of its time now. The journal is all about applied AI. It's very dense, very technical, very mathematical, very engineering. The range of applications is enormous. There is almost no domain in which neurocomputing and other AI techniques are not being used. And also the type of techniques being developed is expanded. So that reflects a boom, I showed you earlier on, the kind of commercial development boom in AI. And I think this reflects the research and R&D boom in AI. And with that boom, I think it's pertinent to stand back and say, do we really understand the risks? Well, this AI is now everywhere. It's all around us. It's touching our lives, whether we know it or not. Do we really understand the risks of what is now happening with AI? Now, it's absolutely true that the power of the technologies of AI, there are many of them actually, and the extent to which it's being used is massively greater than it was before and expanding exponentially. And there have already been significant examples of where either through deliberate misuse or perhaps inadvertent misuse, there have been very negative consequences. A lot of the audience might know the stories about Cambridge Analytica and its relationships with Facebook. There were arguments about whether or not that was kind of, very deliberately arrogant. It was using AI for consumer profiling, which is effectively monetizing your time on the Facebook platform. But that then went from consumer profiling into manipulating users for other purposes, effectively addicting users to be online. If we'll send you any kind of information, we've profiled you, we know what you're interested in or what you're more likely to read, and while you're reading, you're online and we can monetize your time. And that arguably was used in a very manipulative way by dark forces around the EU referendum in the UK and then the 2016 US election. And there have been very, very significant things written about that and possibly even crimes committed. Another story which I think is really interesting is a company called Clearview AI. It's a company in America. The CEO is a relatively young Vietnamese American. They scraped 6 billion images from social media platforms without permission to create labeled training databases for facial recognition systems, which are then used as investigative tools by not only police forces and other investigative agencies, but indeed other organizations. And there are all sorts of issues about the kind of privacy and the permissions around using images, but also the construction of that data and the algorithms are used, because there are significant biases in that software, which could lead to people of particular ethnic backgrounds, for example, being much more likely to be identified as a person of interest in an investigation. The backlash against this software was profound. I was recovering from surgery on my spine a year and a half ago and watched, as I was recuperating with amazement, how that chief executive went out trying to kind of, justify what they'd done. But in the end, I think something like half of the police forces in America that were using this software dropped it. It in turn led Google to rethink what they were doing with facial recognition, and there was a whole big fallout. And indeed, that I think is a good example of a company that didn't think it through, then tried to bolt on ethics and kind of repair the damage afterwards, and it didn't work, and it usually doesn't work. And they paid a heavy commercial price as a result. And I think there's a lesson in that. Now, I think there are some relatively worrying trends in the development of AI, one of which is deepfakes. Deepfakes is just essentially the idea of using AI technology, typically for audio or visual, to take an image or a video or an audio recording and of someone else and effectively put someone else's face and voice in there. And you can see these two images here. They both look like Tom Cruise. One of them's, in fact, they're both from video clips. One is Tom Cruise doing a magic trick and the other one is Tom Cruise on a golf course chatting, but neither of them are Tom Cruise. And indeed, if you watch the videos of these, are very, very convincing. Now that sounds like, it's all just a bit of a gimmick, but is it a gimmick when you think that through? Because when you've got politicians who, if they're caught out having done something very, very wrong, and there are plenty of examples of that, and they can say, but that's not me, that's not real, that's fake. I think that brings the question, can we ever believe our eyes and our ears? And there could be very, very pernicious uses of deepfake technology. Some colleagues might have seen the idea of what's now called deep nostalgia, and a company called MyHeritage took that deepfake technology a little bit further, kind of the same idea, to take still photographs of dead relatives and animate them. And again, at first pass, that might sound like a kind of cool thing to do, and you can see, images of Abraham Lincoln and all this. But I think there are some questions about using that technology at a time when someone's going through, loss and grief, and this idea of trying to hold on to someone who no longer is there. I think there are kind of some issues around that. I've already talked about what happened with Facebook. It is absolutely clear that the AI filters on a variety of social media platforms, not only Facebook by any manner of means, create what you might call bubbles and echo chambers. And that is undoubtedly a contributing factor to how things like conspiracy theories spread. And I picked this out because I absolutely believe that the AI filters in social media platforms played a significant part in what led to the insurrection and the attack on the Capitol in Washington, D.C. on the 6th of January this year. And I think we should all be very, very worried about that. And then I get nervous, I get a bit queasy when I hear a lot of talk about kind of an arms race. We've got to win. Everybody's going to win. America's got to win. You've got to win in AI. China needs to win in AI. Russia wants to win in AI. The whole conversation around a metaphorical arms race is kind of a zero-sum game. It implies someone's got to win and someone else has to lose. Actually, I think what we really want is AI for the good of all. And I know that can sound really cheesy and motherhood and apple pie, but the idea of a rising tide raises all ships is certainly where I am. The idea of AI should be developed for the good of all people. So the metaphorical arms race of kind of winning and losing is bad, but the actual arms race, the actual militarization of AI, I think is a very, very worrying trend. There's a lot of it now, seeing kind of autonomous drones, weaponized AI in various forms. And for some time there have been attempts to develop concordats to avoid this. But the narrative goes, if the other side has it, we have to have it. The war of the future will be over in seconds and minutes, not months and years. So if the other guy has it, we've got to have it. Of course, that was the exact narrative of the nuclear arms race, and that put the world at peril too. So I'm concerned about the winning and losing metaphor, and I'm also concerned about the actual militarization of AI. For those of you that might not know much about what AI is and kind of, be thinking through these concerns, I'd really like to recommend to you that you go and look for this documentary. It's called We Need to Talk About AI. It's about 90 minutes long. I think you can find it on Sky. And it's very, very good as a kind of public science piece around what AI is, where it's going, and some of these issues. It was made by a lady called Leanne Pooley, who lives in New Zealand, a good friend of mine and a member of our editorial board on our journal AI and Ethics, actually helped to make this movie, and it's a really good piece. But there is also another documentary I really strongly recommend, and it's called Coded Bias. And Coded Bias is a fantastic piece which really sets out why some of this technology has intrinsically and inherently bad outcomes. So it starts with a story of a lady called Joy Buolamwini, who was a researcher at MIT. And she had the idea of creating a thing called the Inspire mirror. So the idea was this mirror has embedded facial recognition, tracking and recognition technology, and it sees you, and it then projects an image of a person who inspires you. And in her case, I think it was Serena Williams, or one of the female tennis players. So the idea, you get up in the morning, you're feeling a bit down, and you go and look in the mirror, and there is the person who inspires you. You want to go and be that person, and you're inspired to go and be the best you can be. But she discovered that the facial tracking and recognition software that she was using couldn't track her face. And she kept it short. There was a problem with the lighting. She thought it was a problem with the coding. Until she put that white mime mask on, and then it tracked her perfectly. And it turned out that the facial recognition software is actually inherently racially biased. It's good at tracking white males and very bad at tracking black females. And that led her to go on to really dig into these issues around not only facial recognition, but other issues around AI. And indeed, she went on with others to create what's called the Algorithmic Justice League. And there are many, really kind of positive things happening as a result of that. And again, this is another documentary movie, about an hour and a half long. It's I think running right now on Netflix. Again, I could commend this to you. Go and watch this, and you'll learn a lot about what's happening with AI and what these kind of issues are. And it's certainly true that facial recognition is a specific concern. I've already mentioned the issues around the clear view AI. I've mentioned this issue with Joy Bulamwini and her work. That's led to, for example, the British Security Industries Association trying to launch an ethical framework around the use of facial recognition. There have been briefing notes from the UK government on the use of facial recognition, and a whole new narrative, I think, around the fact that some of the AI technology has deep-rooted biases in it, which need to be thought through and hopefully ironed out. So I would say that we need to have ethical AI, but the question is, how do you do that? Do we need self-regulation? Do we need new laws? How do you go about achieving that? Well, it's certainly true that there are questions as to whether or not AI now needs to be regulated in a different way. And there's a lot of work going on all over the world. A very good friend of mine, Lord David Putnam, was a member of the House of Lords Select Committee here in the UK, which produced its first report in 2018. It came up with 5 broad recommendations, which even I argued back with David, who was a member of the committee. These were kind of motherhood and apple pie. You know, AI for good, AI should do no harm, that kind of stuff. The EU has been working on recommendations and regulations, and recently actually published its first kind of set of frameworks. And the White House in the States has been doing the same thing. The Australian government, the Singapore government, there's all sorts of stuff going on. And indeed, the Chinese government working on various frameworks around how to regulate and possibly legislate to govern AI. A lot of companies are now committing to ethical AI. I talked at the beginning about that boom in the commercialization and productization of AI. And so lots of companies are developing their codes of ethics around AI. And I picked this one out because I like it for 2 reasons. Number one, it comes from an organization you wouldn't necessarily immediately think of. The fact that it comes from an automotive company and saying, wow, an automotive company is developing its code of ethics around AI. But also, as a graphic, it's very clean, very easy to read, and it actually covers most of what I would argue are the key bases you need to cover if you want to think through what do you have to consider and do to make sure you're developing ethical AI. But having an ethical framework isn't enough. The Lehman Brothers was arguably the bank that really spawned the financial crash in 2008. The Lehman Brothers had a very, very well-developed risk management framework for investment, but they just weren't using it. They were ignoring all of that framework in the pursuit of profit. And actually, there is an argument to say that having an ethical framework and not using it is worse than not having one at all, because it gives the window dressing the illusion of ethics, but actually not actually doing, kind of walking that walk. And so there are those that really think that, in fact, it'd be better if you're not going to use it, then not having a framework would be better, because at least it would be transparent that there's no protection there. I often get questions about fairness and transparency. They are components of, but not the same as, not synonymous as, ethical AI. It's certainly true that having fairness is part of ethics. Transparency and accountability are parts of ethics, and lack of bias for sure. But so please don't think those words are the same. They're kind of, again, a bit like the AI and machine learning and deep learning subsets of each other. So I've been working in applied AI for 30 years. I believe in AI. And I'm very proud of some of the applications and solutions and systems that I and my teams have developed. And indeed, I kind of got on a bit of a high horse about all of that stuff. Towards the end of the 1990s into the early 2000s, I also became a bit of an evangelist, because I believe that the AI community is not very good at telling the outside world about the very good things we do and explaining what AI is and helping people understand it. We're very good at telling each other. We go and present at conferences and publish in journals, but we don't really have the kind of, if you like, popular science spokesperson that perhaps, for instance, physics has, in Brian Cox here in the UK, or Michio Kaku and Neil deGrasse Tyson in the US, who take very, very complex stuff and make it very accessible to the public. We don't really have that in AI at this point, I believe. So I would go out and tell people and try to be an evangelist. But I also, I think about 6, 7 years ago, started to see things developing that were making me queasy. I believe in AI, I believe it can do good things and does do good things, but also I could see things happening that were making me very queasy. And as a result of that, last year, along with my good friend and colleague, Professor Larry Medsker, who's at George Washington University in DC, worked with my publisher Springer to create this new journal on AI and ethics. And we launched this in October of last year. These are just a few examples of the kind of very, very high quality papers. These are thought leadership papers from some of the leading thinkers and practitioners in AI and ethics across the world that we published early on through the journal. And I've got a bit of a belief now that I believe that AI has reached a particular point, perhaps not unlike where genetic science was 20, 25 years ago. Genetic science was very good at self-regulating because the medical and life sciences fields typically have very, very robust ethical checks and balances systems. But AI is developed as a kind of new technology, really without those rigorous processes. But it's certainly true that genetics got to the point where there had to be both the internal debate in the community and the external debate around the fact that you could do something didn't mean to say that you should do it. And I believe what happened was genetic science did two things very well. It accepted the need for external regulation, but it also internally regulated extremely well. I think that's where AI is now. And in fact, I believe it's possible that we've already passed that tipping point and we really need to address that. And because of that, in our new journal, this is the editorial that Larry and our publishing editor, Rachel, jointly authored for the first issue of the journal, in which I make that exact point, that I believe we've passed this tipping point, and that the fact that you can do things with AI does not now mean that you should, and you should think those things through. Now, I've got to be honest, I've nicked this quote from a Spider-Man film. With great power comes great responsibility. I think it's Spider-Man's uncle says it to Peter Parker. And the point is that the big tech companies now hold a massive responsibility about the future of AI and the direction it takes. Those companies are, we already saw this huge boom in the commercialization of AI. Of course, that's not only in the big tech companies, but a massive proportion of it is. And indeed, not only a massive proportion of the research, but also of the researchers, the people doing that work. And I believe that that places a very significant responsibility on them to look after those researchers, support them, and make sure that their work is going in the right direction. And the question is that happening? Now, when we talk about big tech, who are we talking about? I'll commend you to have a look at this book by Amy Webb. It's an excellent book. And in this book, Amy argues that although big tech can be defined in many ways, and there are lots of companies involved, but actually there are just nine companies who have a massive amount of power and influence in this field. And those nine, 6 in the US and 3 in China, are responsible for a lot of that commercialization of AI and employ a huge proportion of the research community. So clearly there's a big responsibility on these big nine. And if you're wondering who they are, that's them. Alibaba, Amazon, Apple, Baidu, Facebook, Google, IBM, Microsoft, and Tencent. Now, are those big nine companies walking the walk and executing that responsibility? Well, there are certainly worrying developments. Colleagues might know about the story of a lady called Timnit Gebru. Timnit was involved as part of the AI research team at Google. She was a co-author to a paper which was basically flagging ethical concerns about the development of large speech generating models, GPT-3 and other things like that. Google says she resigned. She says she was fired. And there's a lot of evidence that shows what actually happened was They asked her to remove her name as a co-author to a paper, and when she refused, she was fired. And indeed, another lady in the team called Margaret Mitchell was also fired. And then the team leader resigned in protest. And you've got to look at that and say, wow, what on earth is going on in the AI team at Google with, there's a lot of concern about whether or not Google was effectively suppressing counterfactual research and treating researchers badly. The head of AI at Facebook is a guy called Yann LeCun. And Yann LeCun has a really interesting stance, which is that if anybody criticizes what Facebook is doing with AI, he'll go out on the attack. He goes on rants on Twitter, and he'll blame anything and anyone except Facebook and AI for any of the consequences, which I believe in part, not only, but in part, is in fact coming from what Facebook is doing with AI. And so the question is, can big tech really be trusted? And as you can see from these headlines, some of it about Temra Gubru, some of others, look at that quote there from Meredith Whittaker, the faculty director at the AI Now Institute. At any moment, a company can spike your work or shape it so it functions more as PR than as knowledge production in the public interest. And that's arguably what happened with Temra Gubru, and it's arguably what's happened elsewhere. That's got to be a real serious concern. And I would argue there's precedent here, because look at what happened with the tobacco industry, what was referred to as big tobacco. The tobacco industry, and you see here particularly the chief executives of the big 7 tobacco companies, giving evidence to a congressional hearing in 1994. They became known as the 7 Dwarfs. And that picture there shows all 7 swearing under oath. So they swore, and within minutes, they perjured themselves, because they were asked directly, are your products harmful? Are they addictive? Do they cause cancer and other diseases? And they knew the truth, and they all lied. And indeed, while they were lying, they were in the process of adding things to their products to get you to inhale more deeply, to get addicted more quickly, and even targeting advertising to children. So big tobacco is not the model, is it? Well, what you've got there is they lied, they suppressed counterfactual evidence, they attacked individual researchers and whistleblowers, very much like the arguments I've just made about what's happening with some of the big tech companies. And what happened? Well, they were sued, they were fined, and they were very heavily regulated. But one of the outcomes is no one trusts them. I would argue that no one trusts big tobacco, even the people who smoke. Even the people who are addicted to their products don't trust the companies who are selling the products. And I think that's a lesson for big tech right now, that we don't want big tech to become the big tobacco of AI. And colleagues on my editorial board and I am very, very humbled to have the opportunity to be a co-author to this paper, which makes that argument, that what we want is big tech to look after researchers, to support intellectual freedom, and make sure that we get a strong ethical community in AI. And you can see here that actually my friend Lord Putnam I mentioned earlier, he argues that some of the stuff that's happening with AI is actually potentially, deeply corrosive to the underpinning of democracy. So, how do you build ethical AI? Well, I would argue that trust in the AI is necessary, and that means trust in the people who develop it. And as I said before, that goes to the big tech companies and whether or not we can trust them, the individual researchers. But I would argue individuals who are involved in either doing research or development or use of AI all have a role. It's certainly true to say that you've got to consider whether or not there are any elements of bias embedded in the AI, either intended or unintended, and weed those out. I think it's really important that those that develop AI are accountable for the impact of AI. Yann LeCun and Facebook don't want to be held accountable for what they're doing, but I think it's really important that anybody developing AI should be accountable for the impact. And I believe there should always be human oversight, and that is not always apparent. And that's one of the reasons why I'm very concerned about the autonomization of intelligent weapons. We're talking about battlefield decisions being taken on the battlefield by an AI entity without human oversight. I don't think is a good idea. And I believe we've all got the opportunity to make a difference as individuals. We've got the opportunity to be part of that individual cog in the ethical ecosystem and kind of take these messages forward. I've heard many times people say to me, well, John, it's just about the data. The Clear View AI problem was, yes, there was an issue about permission in the images, but really it was just the construct of the training data badly. And if you get the training data better, then you'll get rid of the bias. That's not necessarily true. Dame Wendy Hall, who's one of the UK's leading proponents and advocates for AI, this is her quote: "An algorithm is just an opinion embedded in software. We're all human and we all have our biases and prejudices. That's a human flaw. Humans build software. If we simply embed our prejudices in the AI, then we'll get biased and prejudiced AI. And the way to avoid that is have a process of design to design the ethics in. And many AI developments do not have that. So I believe we need ethics by design." So my personal view is that I still believe in the power of AI to bring huge benefits to society. I still believe AI gets a lot of bad press. And I believe that those developing AI can't ignore the risks. I think that we do need an advocate to go out and be better than I could ever be at telling people about the good things that AI is doing, but we also need to be honest about what the risks are and address those risks. And therefore we should all, everyone working in AI, take some responsibility and really try to push to make sure that the future of AI is built on very sound ethics. And to close, people sometimes say, should we be frightened of artificial intelligence? Well, I don't fear artificial intelligence, I fear human stupidity. And I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions from that photograph. So thanks very much, thanks for listening, and I'd be very happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, John. That was really interesting. So for now, we're going to take a 5-minute break. And I'll just remind everyone watching that John very kindly allowed us to record his talk. So if you know anyone that would be interested in this topic and wants to watch it later, in a few days the talk will be uploaded to the Palace of Science YouTube channel, and you can watch it there along with all of our previously recorded talks that have happened during lockdown. And to follow on from that, actually, if this particular topic has got you thinking about AI and you're interested in knowing a bit more about the applied science itself, our previous CyberSciBar speaker from May, Dr. Marina Freitag, she's a research fellow at Newcastle University. She gave us a talk about a new technology that her and her team had developed. It was a new photovoltaic cell that allowed smart technology to be powered under very low ambient light conditions. And she went on to talk about how that technology was then going to be trained using AI to be autonomous, able to function without any human input under sort of office-like conditions, so without any other external power. So that's very much more the applied science of the technology that's out there, and you can find that on the Palace of Science YouTube channel as well. So we'll have a break now. As I said, we've got a lovely quiz that have been put together by one of our volunteers, so you can test your existing AI knowledge, and we'll be back in 5 minutes for the question and answer session. So don't forget to stick all your questions into the chat box and we will pose them to John shortly. See you in 5 minutes. Hi everyone, welcome back. So I can see from the chat box that you've all had quite a few thoughts about the talk that you just heard, and we've got some questions coming in, which is great. So I think I'll just dive right in. So welcome back, John. Thanks for the great talk. It was really fascinating, and you certainly packed in a lot of information in a short space of time there, but I suppose it's a big topic, isn't it? One thing I wanted to ask to kick off, so my background is biological sciences, and I work with honeybees. As an insect, we don't have to submit any sort of ethical statement for any of the experiments we do. But if I worked with any other higher order animal or humans, I would have to. I'm wondering, in terms of AI research, is there anything like an ethical statement that needs to be submitted for the technology that might be developed?
I think that's one of the things around that. Research being done in AI, I think fits very much in that kind of computer science, engineering space where in a research ethics committee sense inside universities, unless there's kind of direct work with human subjects, then probably not. So there'll be some, the very, very generic stuff that you do, but not stuff which is about what could be the ethical consequences of the outcomes of the application of the technology. That's not, I think, typically done. And it's certainly, I think, where some of the considerations that have got formed into the European framework for legislation, the stuff that's been done here by initially the House of Lords, the Turing Institute is looking at this kind of stuff that's been done in the States. So without that kind of those frameworks to use, the development of those frameworks is, I think, an imperative, but also the imperative for research teams to stand back and look at it and consider these issues. Do we really understand whether or not the way we're approaching this could lead to bias? Where would be the issues of how do we ensure the issues of transparency and accountability? Do we have human agency and oversight in the loop of how AI is being used? So you recall that one of the slides was that nice easy graphic from BMW. If you go back and look at that, the kind of headlines on that, they're a good start to be able to say, okay, they're the things we need to think about. So whether or not it's in front of an ethics committee, actually the team doing the work should be thinking about it. And there are those that are strong advocates of the idea of having an AI ethicist as part of the development team. So someone who can bring this to bear and say, hey, before we go there, we need to think about this.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of our audience members touches on part of that in their question, asking, is regulation around AR far behind the technological development of AI? Are government agencies ready and set up for the challenge, do you think?
And the short answers are yes and no. So yes, the regulatory frameworks and legislation is miles behind the technology. And that's how we've got to the point of what have been very, very negative outcomes and examples of the use of AI technology, with significant issues emerging from them, and then the attempt to walk those back. So yes, the legislative and regulatory frameworks and governance frameworks are behind the technology. Are all of the agencies ready? Absolutely not.
I did wonder, actually, following on from that, you mentioned, obviously, you brought in the example of genetics and how that had been regulated very strictly. But generally, when we think about things like genetic modification, how people learnt about that, the first thing they learnt about generally for a lot of people was negative, and that was repeated over and over. And as a result, that negative public outlook has really hindered how the progress that can be made from genetic modification. Certainly in the EU, we don't eat any fruit or vegetables that have been genetically modified, despite the fact they're totally safe. There can be huge benefits, but the public just aren't happy with it because of what they've heard. Do you think that similar example can apply to AI, particularly because of the speed it's progressing, that when we learn about things like echo chambers and all the negative things, certainly I've seen it, I presume other people have seen it too, do you think that negativity will have a long-lasting influence on people's perception and what can be done with AI in the future?
Yeah, possibly. I think, I mean, there's a lot to unpack in that. The arguments about what you might call catastrophic points of failure as inflection points as to where a technology goes is an interesting one. I would argue there have already been catastrophic points of failure. I think the Facebook situation with Cambridge Analytica was really, really negative, and there have been an awful lot of things that have flown out of that. Clearview, to some extent, it caused a really big ripple through the AI community, particularly around facial recognition, and there have been others. I think if you're coming from the other side, I think the public is aware that their lives are now being touched on by what they would broadly probably call algorithms. And some of the algorithms aren't AI and aren't intelligent at all, but quite a bit of things around their online profile and life, their things like their personal finance, even their health and healthcare, are all now being impacted by systems which include AI. And I think that's becoming more and more understood, even if what AI is and the technology is not necessarily understood. And then I'll bring a third point of triangulation, which is, as I said before, the kind of popular culture and media, which is almost always negative towards AI. So that you start from a point of negativity, be scared of AI, be frightened of it, even though you don't know what it is. Be aware that it's doing things to you in the background of your life, and then but feel powerless to do anything about that. Now, so I already mentioned the regulatory frameworks are behind the technology. The public agencies are behind in those regulatory frameworks, and there are those that are just out there driving for profit. And it's true, and I've spoken to a number of people, including colleagues who are now on my editorial board for the AI and Ethics Journal, who were in that corporate world, who got out of it for this very reason. Look, it's clear that what you've got is often alpha male-driven development teams just driving to get product out to market and make money out of it. And put that all together, and that's a heady mix that feels like there are a lot of problems coming down the road. But on the other side, at least we're now having these conversations. What I think is fascinating is the situation with the lady I mentioned, Timna Gubru, when she was fired by Google, became a massive worldwide story. And that's a good thing insofar as it shone a very harsh light on what that particular big tech company is doing and the way they're treating their researchers and what's happening with what they're doing with AI. And in that kind of spirit of light being a disinfectant, I think that's got to be a good thing. I do wonder when the next, quote, catastrophic point of failure is coming.
Definitely. Another question from our audience. So since AI and machine learning has become so accessible to smaller companies without huge teams and big pots of money, how do you think we can encourage them to be ethical?
So the first, I think, is they have to understand that there are issues about not only the way they may use and deploy AI, but the way the AI is developed in the first place. A lot of smaller companies will use things like open source code that embed things into their products without having thought through whether or not that bit of code that they're using, a bit like Joy Bulamwini with the code she used for the Inspire Mirror, not without realizing it has problems, and that means the way they use it will inherently have problems. So they need to think that through. And in its simplest form, you don't have to be a professional ethicist or a philosopher, but you just have to have someone who's involved in development of use of AI, who's asking the question. And I would think, as a very first simple start, that would be it.
Another very relevant question from our audience. So thinking of the BMW slide and the self-driving cars, will AI be held to a higher standard than humans due to the negative perception, and should it be?
I'm not sure that AI would be held to a higher standard. The issue, there's a fundamental conundrum, a philosophical conundrum known as the trolley problem with self-driving cars, which is this whole thing about, so the vehicle has got a decision to make, and is it going to decide to kill the pedestrian who's pushing a baby in a buggy, or is it going to kill the owner of the vehicle who's riding in the vehicle? And of course, if you say, well, in fact, that's an ethical question of 2 lives versus 1 life, and the vehicle is going to make a decision to minimise harm to human life, who's going to buy that car? How do you prioritise that? So I think what we have to have is clarity on accountability, and that I think has been the question. The question of higher standard. It's the standard we should be applying right across, the principles of do no harm, and so it's applying the same standard to AI of accountability and transparency as you would if it was a human agent. If that was a human driving the car, you would say, well, it's accountable. You can't then kind of pull your hands back and say, well, the AI is not accountable. Yes, it is. But what you mean by that really is the company that developed is accountable.
Are there any examples like that? I've always thought a lot about that one, and always thought if it was a human driving the car, I would imagine 9 times out of 10 they would swerve rather than just think I'm going to save myself and kill this pedestrian and buggy. Are there any examples where AI has specifically been designed because that way, because that's what the human would do, even though there is other options?
Yes, and there are all sorts of ways and mechanisms by which that can be the case, and the AI has been used in all sorts of what I've generally referred to as safety critical systems with great effect. So there has been loads of really good examples. Self-driving vehicles have a particular kind of visibility and a particular pertinence right now, but they do have these kind of very significant ethical conundrums about the real underlying question is it safe, and is it safe enough? That's really the question that's being asked.
Yeah. Are we seeing a plateau in the development of AI applications, or are we still seeing innovative applications of the technology emerging?
Oh, wow, certainly no plateau. It's the opposite. So I see through the editorship of NC&A and also the work that I do and the people I speak to around the world, some really fascinating stuff. The techniques and technologies in AI are broadening and expanding. I'm seeing an awful lot of stuff which is in one form or another. This is why I italicized a couple of words on the opening slide about what is AI, because that definition talks about human intelligence, but actually there are many AI models which aren't mimicking human intelligence, but they're effectively mimicking the way nature has found a solution to a problem. So you talked about kind of bees. There's a lot of insect-based or insect-modeled behaviors which have become kind of model AI solutions. Swarming, flocking, ants, all kinds of things. So there are manifold examples now of AI developers who've used the model of nature and tried to find what is the underpinning rationale, if you want to call it that, in the way that nature has evolved a solution, and then try and mimic that into AI. So that's why my definition would be wider than human intelligence. It would be natural intelligence. Yeah, it's rock and roll. AI right now is rock and roll. It's an incredible time to be involved in AI. I've talked and tried to give a more positive picture at the end. There are these questions, but it's actually incredibly fascinating, and there are a lot of really, really good things being done in AI.
And I'm going to have to take this opportunity as well to say that actually with the natural examples of developing AI, my supervisor during my PhD, some of her research on the visual system of the locust was used in conjunction with the car company to develop the technology that beeps as you're reversing to tell you how close something is. And that was based on how locusts see approaching birds. And they did it by strapping the locust down and showing it the opening credits to Star Wars as they're flying through space.
Really?
Yes, they won an Ig Nobel Prize for it, so you can look that up, but it's really, really cool.
and indeed, compound eyes have been the inspiration for quite a number of AI models.
Yeah. We also have robot bees now as well, which I'm very interested in working with because I'm not so keen on being stung by the real bees. So another question from our audience. What are your scratch the surface views on artificial general intelligence?
So the whole pursuit of AGI, which is the idea of having most AI is narrow. So I say most, I would argue all AI is narrow. And indeed, there's a lady called Maureen Cordell who coined a phrase many years ago, which she called it graceful degradation, that a really good AI system demonstrated graceful degradation of its performance outside the narrow task for which it was developed. So if I develop a neural network which is trained to be able to recognize the difference between 5 different categories of things, it's usually absolutely rubbish at doing anything else. It doesn't know anything else. It's very narrow. The concept of AGI is to have more like human intelligence, in which we're able to understand and deal with lots of different things in life, including things we've never experienced before and all of that. The question is one, will AGI emerge? Answer, I think probably. 2, is it close? Answer, probably not. And depending on who you speak to in AI, you'll get an answer in the next 10 years, 50 years, 500 years. And I'm probably more of the, I don't think in my lifetime. But I think AGI will probably emerge, not least because of the way that the power of the technologies and techniques and the availability to deal with vast, vast quantities of data, which we think we don't, but we do. Every day of our lives, a human being is dealing with a huge amount of data. And the ability to develop artificial systems that can also deal with huge quantums of data of all different sorts, with many, many of those being kind of completely novel experiences, leads you towards the suggestion that something akin to AGI will probably emerge. Next question, is that a good thing? Ellipsis points. That very much depends on how we go about framing the ethical construct of AI now. I think this is the land of, the Matrix and Terminator and all the rest of that stuff. So I think AGI probably will emerge. I think it'll be not in my lifetime, so I would be in the decades to hundreds of years probably. And I think whether or not that's a good thing depends on what we do now.
The next question, bit of a doomsday one. Do you think AI could contribute to the destruction of the entire human race, say, in the next 100 years? And as a follow-up to that, have you read Toby Ord's The Precipice?
The answer is yes and no. So no, I haven't read The Precipice. But there are many other apocryphal stories of doom around what may or may not happen. I think the answer clearly is yes, that AI could contribute, as indeed could many other things. And again, I'll go to, and therefore how to avoid that is really dependent on what we do now. We've arrived at that point. I believe we're past that tipping point where we now really must ask these questions. And one of the ways to deal with that, and I go back to the point about genetics, one of the strengths I think that you talked about, there's a lot of negative things, a lot of negative perceptions, but there are also some really strong individual ethical behaviors and ethical regulation, and then group behavior and societal behavior and regulations and kind of frameworks that emerge as well. So AI doesn't yet have all of that, but we can get there, and that's very much what I'm trying to kind of promote here.
Yeah, definitely. It's worth thinking about. And obviously, don't worry too much about AI ending the world. There could be another pandemic. Who knows? You mentioned that the field of AI in general doesn't have a big sort of public engagement spokesperson. Do you think part of the reason for that is the speed at which it's progressing and how people are being introduced to it almost instantaneously, that there's not time to promote it as such beforehand?
Maybe, I'm not really sure that is the question. I think I'm not really sure why it's the case that we don't. Actually, Major Kaku has started to become something of a kind of public speaker on AI and that kind of very popular science. And there are one or two others, but not in the sense to which I think in some of the other fields in natural history, you've got people like David Attenborough, obviously, and others who've been these fantastic sort of icons of helping to develop public understanding and breaking down barriers of when I say ignorance, I mean that kind of lack of knowledge. Mm-hmm. I don't really think we've done a good job of that. I think maybe it's because of who we are. We being the AI community tend to be, the journal I showed you before, Neurocomputing Applications, is certainly not something accessible to the public. It's very, very, very dense, technical, mathematical, engineering stuff. And that's who we are. If you go, I'm a space geek, and you go back to the Apollo program that put men on the moon, one of the things the astronauts hated was be asked, how did it feel? Because actually they're kind of test pilots and engineers, and they could tell you what the pressure was and they could relate to data, but they weren't very good at that much more kind of expounding thing. And I think maybe that's actually more to do with it. We're good at talking to each other about the data and the algorithm and the maths and the stats and the model, but we're not necessarily good at getting out there and trying to break down those barriers and get the public to understand and come on the journey with us. And I think if somebody did emerge who's better than me at doing it, then that would be a good thing.
Yeah, I think certainly it's a skill, and it's one I think scientists and researchers are becoming more aware that they need, but it's not one that is strictly taught. And that's certainly why Palace of Science is here. We like to find people that can speak in general terms, easy to understand about their field and are passionate about it. So certainly thank you to you for speaking this evening. And I do want to ask, if you had to choose one person to be a David Attenborough or a Brian Cox to represent and talk and promote AI, who would it be?
That's a tough call. That's a very tough call. Wow. That is a real tough call.
Feel free to pick a colleague. It sounds like you don't know anyone.
No, I know many people who are, I mean, because of the very thing I'm talking about, that we tend to be good at talking to each other. Probably someone like Max Tegmark.
Okay.
Richard Carter was very good, of course, but it tends to be more about kind of physics and astrophysics. And there's a guy called Noel Sharkey who has been a long-standing advocate for what AI can do for good, but also in very particular terms about being against the weaponization and militarization of AI. And Noel's a wonderful speaker.
Excellent. So now our audience know who to look out for in the future when they see that name. So I think that's all of the questions from the audience. So I will end on an easier one for you. Obviously in your talk you recommended 2 documentaries, but what is your favorite fictional AI film?
It's called Bicentennial Man, and it's Robin Williams, and it's because the story, it was one of the few that presents AI in a kind of more positive light, and it's the story of a robot who goes on a journey over 200 years to become recognized as a citizen and as a person. And it's a very heartwarming story. It's funny and maybe even a bit corny, but I love it.
Well, thank you so much, John. That was a great talk. We're getting a lot of really good feedback from the audience. It was very much appreciated and enjoyed. So thank you for that. And as I said earlier, for the audience, if you are interested in learning more about the technology that might power AI in future, our previous CyberSciBar speaker in May, Dr. Marina Freitag, spoke to us about some of the photovoltaic technology that she has helped to create that may be involved in this. Unfortunately, we don't have an organised speaker for next month, but I'm certainly on the lookout. But if you want to continue watching CyberSciBar talks next month, and you particularly enjoyed tonight's talk from a speaker from the University of Sunderland, we've previously had some excellent speakers from the University of Sunderland. Dr. Becky Owens talked about body modification and the history of tattooing in the UK, and Dr. Amy Pearson talked about the myths and misconceptions of autism. And you can find all of those and speakers from the other universities in the Northeast on the Palace of Science YouTube channel. As I said earlier, the topic for tonight was actually requested by one of our audience members. We are more than happy to take requests. In fact, I really enjoy it. I enjoy trying to find a speaker to fit this topic tonight, and hopefully I was successful in your eyes. I think so. You can contact Palace of Science on our website or through any of our social media channels, so Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. The Palace of Science YouTube channel is there for you to look back on what we've been doing in lockdown. And also, if you feel the need to support us further, at the moment all of our events are online, but looking forward we will be returning to in-person, and we are dying to get back and do our annual festival, so you can actually come and meet some scientists and see lots of exciting interactive exhibits. You can help us to fundraise through no extra cost to yourself using a platform called Easy Fundraiser. So this is where essentially you go shopping online as normal. After you've signed up to Easy Fundraiser, you can select Palace of Science as your donation, and a small percentage of what you spend online will come to us, so we can use it to put on more new and exciting events. So as I said, follow all our social media to find out what we're doing in future. And thank you so much for joining us tonight, and let us know if you would like to see anything in particular in future. So hopefully see you next month.